Welcome to another episode of Project PhDcast with me, Alison Innes. I love doing conversational podcasts, so I'm really excited to have a guest with me on today's episode. Darrin Sunstrum will be a familiar voice to anyone who has listened to MythTake, which is the podcast he and I created together between 2016 and 2020. That podcast on Greek and Roman mythology has, as of recording, 32 episodes and over 50,000 downloads. And I'm actually pretty proud of that because we never did any paid advertising. And people still continue to find it and enjoy it. So given our expertise in Greco-Roman mythology from TAing it and studying it ourselves, and given the fun we have recording together, Darrin was a natural conversational partner for today's topic. For one of my PhD classes, we were asked to read an article that looked at academic identity in the context of the heroic narrative. So, of course, I would want to talk to Darrin about this. The article is titled Academic Identity, Scholarly Identity, and the Hero's Journey by Trevor Norris, and I've put a link to it in the show notes in case you want to read it and share your thoughts as well. So here goes. I hope you enjoy our conversation. All right. Welcome to Project PhDcast, Darrin.
Oh, welcome.
You are my first in-person guest.
Oh, I'm honored. It's a privilege. It's nice to sit across the microphone from you again.
It is. This is a little bit like old times.
Yeah, sort of.
Sort of, but we are in my office,
Yep.
And we have a different setup. And we're still talking about myth.
So, yeah, in a way.
In a way.
Yeah.
So today's topic, actually, I should introduce you first.
Okay.
So my guest today is Darrin Sunstrum, and he is my long forbearing co-host of MythTake. And actually, I can credit you with getting me into podcasting in the first place. We started MythTake in 2016, and we recorded episodes up to 2020. And we both come from a classics background.
That's right.
And we like to talk about myth.
Yep.
So for my PhD class, we were given an editorial to read about academic identity and scholarly identity and the hero's journey. And we've had a few conversations about it now, but I thought it would make a great conversation for us to talk about here, ways that the hero's journey works and doesn't work when we think about academic identity.
Mm-hmm.
So for listeners who maybe weren't following us with MythTake, do you want to kind of outline what the hero's journey is and where it comes from and what we're talking about with that term?
In a nutshell, Joseph Campbell, right, a famous mythographer and classicist of his own right, wrote a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in that, he outlined what he called the monomyth, which is a mythological archetype. And it talks about, the journey of the hero, right? And it is a universal tool, right, in order to discuss and analyze, the journey of the hero in many different sources of literature and art and myth.
And the kind of comprehensive pattern of the hero's journey I'm trying to remember, it's got
11.
like 11. I was going to say 16. It's been a while since I've had to teach it. It's got quite a number, quite a few steps.
Yeah.
Maybe we can see how many we can remember here.
They're not all applicable.
Well, they're not all applicable to every story, but
Right.
but the general gist of this is the hero is given a quest or a mission. They take off. They face some kind of adversity, some kind of challenges. There's usually some kind of underworld portion or extremely dangerous, some kind of
Mm-hmm.
difficult rite of passage. Then they come out of that and they eventually return to their home community and reintegrate.
Right.
And there are helpers along the way, helper
Often.
maidens often.
Yeah.
Traditionally in Greek mythology and in some literature, it's usually women helping a male hero.
That can happen. The three phases of the hero's journey have often been boiled down into separation, initiation, and return. And I think that Trevor Norris's editorial does a pretty good job of providing that, trinity, that complex. The thing that you had mentioned, which I think is an important point that is not really discussed here, is the hero as a liminal figure, and that the transitions from one phase to the next are often just as important as the phase itself. So moving from one thing to another is, at least in my opinion, is probably something that is often overlooked, right?
Yeah.
But is extremely important in helping defining what a hero actually is in the context that we're talking about. I know that the context of this is somewhat different.
And certainly one aspect of the hero's journey that Professor Norris is engaging with here is the idea of the trials and temptations that often beset a hero on the way. And the hero he's looking at here specifically is Odysseus. So what do we remember about Odysseus?
Well, I don't. Is the editorial attempting to make a direct connection between a named hero of the Greco-Roman tradition, or is it just more generally talking about scholarly identity and relating that to sort of the hero, like a sort of like a universal? And I get it. It does mention it in there at one point, but I think that what I think the article is trying to accomplish is just to try to set up a framework for looking at a scholar, establishing a scholar's journey as parallel to, related to the hero's journey. And it's there, right? It's there.
Yeah, so we were discussing it in class, and he refers in the article somewhere, I can't put my eyes on it at the moment, but Odysseus' very long voyage in coming back from Troy. And I think one of the things that Professor Norris is getting at in this article as well is that the process transforms the hero, right? And so, and that is something that when we're engaging with academics, that it is a transformative process.
True.
And that we do have helpers along the way. So we do have those helper figures. We are also helper figures to others. Like we're all the heroes of our own stories, but we also play a role in each other's stories.
Yes. Yeah.
I think some places or some ways that the hero monomyth doesn't necessarily map as well. When I think about it, is heroes, Greco-Roman heroes are really terrible people in many ways, right? They're very flawed figures, and they tend to be very individualistic. They're seeking their personal glory, which I don't think is, it's certainly not my desire in my academic endeavors. It's recognition is lovely and it's wonderful, but I see academics as a very collaborative event. And coming back to thinking about Odysseus as an example, he does lead men, but by the end of it, he's lost everybody. Yeah. And it's very much about, he puts himself in unnecessary danger as well, just for the sake of kleos and time.
Sure. Yeah, right. That's the ultimate prize. And I think that your thinking, your alignment on the topic might, in fact, be somewhat unique. And I would encourage people to think that way, because in their journey, right, in developing their academic and scholarly identity, they're going to need people, right? They're going to need other members of their community to reflect upon, to bounce ideas off, to work with in concert and cooperation, right? And, we develop learning communities in our classrooms. And there's no reason why we can't take that idea and project it forward into a scholarly or research setting, right? And work with that idea, see how that works, and I think it would be quite beneficial.
Definitely, and it's something that I have been thinking a bit more about in terms of some knowledge mobilization workshops that I went to that talk about how to engage people with your research or to create that, but also some of the decolonization workshops where there's when you're working with Indigenous people, there is a very different approach, and it's about collaboration, and it's about a community working together and working with a community to answer their questions, rather than kind of doing your research and then presenting it to a bunch of people and saying, here, I did this research, this will fix your problems.
Right.
In a kind of a bit of a savior complex, so to speak, with that. And again, this is something that, and I brought this up in our classroom discussion about this article as well, is this idea that the hero leaves the community and then the hero comes back to the community and has to reintegrate to the community. And sometimes that community has changed. Maybe it hasn't changed, but the hero has changed. And I was kind of thinking about it, how, again, it's a bit of that solitary, that individual journey. Whereas I think we need to bring our communities with us. Our communities need to be part of that journey with us, sure. To some degree. And maybe by the end of our academic journeys, we're not the same people. Maybe our community shifts and looks a little bit different. But I think that having that community involvement throughout the journey kind of is important.
Oh, yeah, I agree. To get back to the idea of the separation, initiation, and return, that idea of the sort of solo heroic endeavor is ingrained in the recipe. It's baked into the cake. So, when you're talking about your scholarly journey, you're setting yourself up to think already that you are acting independently, right? And an island and unto yourself. And maybe that's not the best framework to take your first few steps, but nonetheless, it's applicable, right? Because 9 times out of 10, that's probably mostly everybody's experience until they get to the point where they realize that, there are others out here that are making a journey as well, right? So, when I just step back from it for a second and I look at the somewhat incongruous nature of the hero as it's being applied in this piece that we're discussing, on face value, the universals seem to work great. But when we get closer to the Greco-Roman hero, we actually see, like you had mentioned, that they're a little, the contrasts are pretty in your face, right? They are inflexible and they are, unchanging. And it's that unchanging quality and that inflexibility that makes them fascinating to an audience. So, they don't change from the beginning to the end, right? And they resist the world and the ethos that they're in. And that's what makes them heroic and often leads to, well, we know what it leads to, tragedy, right? Mm-hmm. Often, 9 times out of 10, it leads to tragedy. So yeah, they are transformative figures, but they help the audience, they help us translate our experience through their experience, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I want to be one of them, but I definitely want to see them go about their journey and learn from that journey and learn how they express, interface, and translate their experiences, because I will be enriched by that observation, right? But I don't want to be Odysseus delayed for 7 years on Calypso's island when I'm trying to get back home, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's a sort of a force field around that figure that, need to be kind of aware of. But I like the idea of it. I like the idea of it, the romance of it.
Yeah, and I think the idea of having some kind of nekusis or I'm blanking out on the other term.
Catabasis?
Catabasis, thank you. Is kind of applicable because we do go through periods in our lives, like academic or not, where we feel like we're experiencing those kinds of things, and we come out the other side changed.
That's it.
I hope my PhD will not be catabasis.
Cerberus need not apply.
I mean, I know it's going to change and influence me.
It always does.
Because it has to. But I'm kind of curious. Like, so you and I have both done master's degrees in the past, and we've spent quite a bit of time kind of, I usually say on the fringes of academia, TAing, but not kind of within the, not researching and whatnot within the formal structures of...
Sure, independent scholarship.
Yeah,
it's generated by your own curiosity and interests.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of curious if you're willing to share about kind of your academic identity and kind of how you see like what we even mean by an academic identity.
Well, the editorial does a really good job of laying out sort of the rough framework of intellectual curiosity and getting its reader to recognize that some of the things that draw our interest, that draw our attention, and that may even for a short time, what seems like sidetrack us, ultimately are a part of our journey, right? And that journey in and of itself, like we had said at the beginning, is transformative, right? When we move through space and time, we experience other things, we grow as a person, because that's just the nature of the human condition. I found myself drawn to mythology. I found myself drawn to heroic narrative. I found myself drawn to, the hero's experience, right? And I see it time and time again. And this is what, again, draws my research focus, draws my attention. And I like to connect dots between things, right? So, it has informed or underwritten my, scholarly identity. It's a conscious decision, right? You make a choice, and then you sort of be able to sort of step back and look and say, hey, for over a decade or two now, I've been doing X, Y, Z because it was important to me, right? And then you can share those ideas, right?
Yeah, I've sometimes felt like I'm very much, or have been very much, in a liminal space, and certainly with my research, my podcasting research, looking at, like, I want to look at people like ourselves who are not in traditional academic fields but are still doing scholarly work and who are using podcasting as part of that. And the irony of it, of course, is that I have gone back into a formal like a formal academic setting to do that.
Right.
And I know that I've often felt tension with being that independent researcher, or kind of that quasi-academic, that I'm not quite a part of the community. I'm not a grad student. I'm not a faculty. And for some people, that's not an issue, and they're excited to talk about ideas and to kind of have those conversations. But there are times that I have certainly felt set apart, intentionally or not, but kind of that I'm not academic enough sometimes for that academic community. But likewise, sometimes I'm too academic for other communities.
Yeah, I get it. I understand. These sort of transition zones are jarring, but again, they're going to stimulate growth. They're going to expose you to new people, new circumstances. And sometimes, these liminal spaces, to use this term, this are, gateways to new adventures, right? So, like I said, they're almost as important as stepping into that space itself. And, from where I sit, I don't want to assume too much, but, talking about your scholarly and research identity, for me, from where I sit at arm's length, it's always been about communication, right? So medium is inconsequential at times. It's more about communicating ideas, right? And the veracity of the communication, the narrative of the community, all those types of things, right, have found their way into your curiosity and into your focus. So I think that's probably something that you'll continue to address in some form or another moving ahead.
Well, yeah, and I mean, one of the things that really excites me about podcast studies and about digital humanities is that it is a space where I don't feel the same kind of borders that I have between who is academic and who isn't.
Yeah.
That I have felt in some spaces in the past. Again, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But there's recognition of practice and lived experience with digital media as having. As giving you some expertise or being able to speak from that experience, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
So the definitions of academic identity that Professor Norris gives in this article, the first one is this idea that we've been kind of talking around, of the academic identity being tied with an academic role in an institution, and as teaching assistants, that is always a very tenuous connection, right? So you are working within a department, you're working with faculty, you're working with grad students, like alongside in terms of helping with teaching, but you don't necessarily, like, that's semester to semester, right? Like there's not like a long-term commitment necessarily there. That other academic roles like faculty would have. So I guess I'm just kind of thinking, like, in terms of that, I mean, we have both been here at Brock doing this kind of work for a very long time. But do you think that kind of changes the feeling of academic identity?
But more the merrier, right? It's multifaceted, and I think like the article talked about the differences in research focus between a K-12 educator and a university professor. They're still moving in the same general direction. It's just that there's tension between the two, right? And your examples from your experience and my experience as well, as far as being a TA or a course coordinator or an instructor or a professor or something like that, right? They're all in the sort of same area. It doesn't generate some sort of tension, I suppose, but I don't really see it as much of an issue, right?
Okay. Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, and like you're a bit further from that grad student experience, perhaps, than I am, although it's already been a decade, which for me, which is hard to believe. But I do remember feeling it quite keenly, especially in those first few years post MA, when I was working as a TA and kind of not.
I know what you're at now. Yeah.
Right. Like you're kind of you're not really one and you're not really the other, and you're trying to figure out who you are, and then how does your research and how does your creativity and your questions fit into a role where you're not designing the course material? You're right.
You're so fixated on the practical that you lose sight of the theoretical. So you don't really want to step into that world yet, because you want to be able to be a whole person in that one space, which is the bare bones, the nuts and bolts, the teaching, right, the practice, right, being able to develop that, to communicate effectively, but also to listen, and then get past all the slings and arrows that are associated with being a classroom teacher or a seminar leader or whatever. And then you begin to see that, if you're intellectually curious, which I think most people are considering the setting, then you start to cultivate those interests and move into less practical, because you got that down, and more into theoretical or develop methodologies that help you, assemble, your curiosity and develop a research mentality. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, and I credit you with the idea of MythTake, because I still remember the day that you came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to do a podcast?" And I said, "How hard can it be?" Right. And it's kind of interesting, because looking back on it, I think the podcast played a really important role in me becoming comfortable as an independent scholar, as somebody who could wear that informal academic label more comfortably, because I was engaging with scholarship, but in a different way from what I would have been doing if I had stayed in grad school, right? Like I wasn't, like we weren't writing academic journals, but we were engaging, we were effectively doing what we call knowledge mobilization in academia, right?
It's and knowledge transmission, right? Whether directly or indirectly, so, and like you said, we went about it in a sort of foolish and naive way.
That's always the best way to start.
But it's the best way to approach it.
If you know too much, you overthink and you get scared.
Right, and then you start talking about imposter syndrome and how do you know what you know and all the rest of it. Let the fools be your guide. But I think that it was an important process of discovery and getting comfortable with your own expertise. And this is something that a lot of people will undoubtedly encounter, right, in their establishing their scholarly identity and establishing their research direction and finding out who they are along that way, right? It's only natural, right? This is something that we encountered with the podcast. And it was always about communication for me too. It was always about, narratives. These stories, they don't tell themselves, right? So when we're confronted with a corpus of work like mythology that drew my interest and yours from classics, we wanted to tell those stories because they don't tell themselves, right? So we translated material, and by that I mean rudimentarily, right? And we talked about material together, And for the most part, people found it interesting, which is fine.
And people are still finding it interesting. I'll put a link in the show notes if anybody wants to check it out.
But interestingly, if those were recorded and never disseminated, I would still have been enriched by the process. So I think this is also something to consider, that there doesn't really need to be that audience in order for you to start to move towards something, right? If it's always about what's over that next hill, you're going to miss it.
Well, and I've got a couple of different things that you've just brought up with that. So just in response to that last thing, one of the exciting things about podcast studies, because it's a new field, is it's still kind of in the process of defining itself and figuring out what is a podcast. Yeah. And from the scholarship that I've read, there is a tendency to think that it has to be listened to be a podcast. And I understand that argument and sure. agree with it, that there is something that happens with the listening of the podcast. But I think there is something with just the simple making of it, because I find in conversation anyway, and I think you've found this the same, but you can certainly correct me, that it wasn't until we were kind of talking about things that the penny would drop on something, or we'd suddenly make a connection that we had kind of maybe it had been in our brains floating around, but it was through the actual conversation that we were constructing and making knowledge, right? And so whether or not anybody ever listened to those podcasts, they were enjoyable to create. Something happened. It's certainly personally, there's a personal, I think there's a personal kind of, transformation is maybe too strong of a word, but there is something about the act of creating something. I feel very strongly that when we create something, it does change us. It does change things. But then we were still creating new knowledge. And so it's kind of interesting to take our experience and then thinking back on the question of okay, so does a podcast have to be listened to be considered a podcast? And my position at the moment, based purely in my own experience, is maybe not.
Maybe not.
But then the other thing that you brought up about being comfortable and getting comfortable with that public through getting comfortable with being an expert and with what you actually know and don't know. I know my MA experience was absolutely fantastic, and it prepared me really well for academic communications and doing conference papers and those kinds of things where you very much have everything all lined up before you open your mouth, and you know where you're going with stuff. Sure. And podcasting really pushed that, because it was a public experiment. We were learning as we went in terms of the format, but then I was putting ideas out there, not knowing who was going to listen to it. And that for me was a big stretch, because I had, again, intentionally or not, I don't know, but I had kind of absorbed this particular way of doing academic knowledge, this particular way of creating knowledge, where you work on it privately and then you present it as a finished thing. And I think that has really changed me, because looking at myself as a scholar now, as I head into my PhD, I learned this term the other day in a knowledge mobilization workshop: community engaged scholarship. And I'm very much a community engaged scholar, I think, or at least I want to be. That's very much my goal, is that I want to engage with the people who are doing the things I research. I want that I want that connection between the theoretical stuff I'm doing and the practical stuff that I'm doing, but also having immediate connections with the communities and the people who can use that knowledge. Maybe, so again, this Project PhDcast is kind of an example of that, because I am doing this on the fly. I'm only just figuring out theme music, and I'm 3 or 4 episodes in. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. My supervisor's going to listen to this. My committee's going to, I'm opening myself up to judgment, and there's vulnerability that's kind of uncomfortable. But at the same time, it means that my ideas are immediately available to people who might want to engage with them.
Right.
And I think that's one of the most exciting things I think about podcasting is kind of that accessibility.
Yeah, I agree. We can have it both ways on this topic, because I don't think that there is a hard and fast rule established yet about the transmission and dissemination and what qualifies and doesn't qualify a podcast. If we take literature as an example, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of books that have been written that no one has ever read, right? But no one in their right mind steps forward and says, well, it's not a book, right? So, I think the process of being an author and writing, or the process of being a podcaster and podcasting, right, is something that we'll continue to look at, right? And what's on the other side of that. And I agree with what you said. I think, it's decision leads to action, right? Indecision is inaction. I'd rather be on the decision side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not too worried about the audience. I think that's something that right, comes about or does not, right? Like,
yeah, and I mean that's something that we had to navigate too when we were starting MythTake. Is
right.
kind of, I had my preconceptions of what I wanted to put out there, which was maybe more polished. Like I had this idea of as much as I hate this word, of being professional
right.
about the podcasting,
right.
and you were kind of on the other side. Well, let's just record stuff and put out and like not
See
worry about things, right? And so we had to kind of navigate a middle ground that worked for both of us, which has influenced me and certainly made me kind of more comfortable with.
Well, take it back to the hero's journey, right? When the hero sets off to go on a quest, and they're already convinced that they're successful because they get to qualify the terms of their own success. So they pick up a spear and a shield and they head out the door and do what they have to do. It's already done at that point, right? Now we're along for the ride, right? Now you can be dissatisfied with the outcome of that journey as a viewer or as an audience, right? But having gone through it, it's entirely a personal experience, right?
And it's what you make of it.
It's what you make of it, right? You could torpedo yourself and shut down and not do anything and just fold up your tent and say, well, I tried and failed, right? And we've seen that happen, right? And this is the way of the world, right? Or you could say, this is a success, qualify that success, because even in failure, right, you're moving towards success. Anything that comes easy, right, check a box. Did I learn? I don't know. Maybe I got lucky, right? Maybe I found myself in the right place at the right time around the right people and just managed to slip through a window, right, where others had fallen on their face. All those things people in their journey are going to think about, right? And they're going to encounter in one form or another, right? So I just would encourage people not to be so hard on themselves.
Well, and this actually ties into a conversation that I had with our friend John, the tattooed historian, who I think I can safely say is also in this PhD program and is a podcaster himself. And the first few times that we talked, I very much kind of downplayed the success we had with MythTake because, I mean, our numbers continue to grow and people continue to find it. And I still get occasionally emails from people who have listened to something. Right. Usually they want us to promote something. And it's like, we haven't done an episode since 2020. So we're probably not going to promote your product. But anyway, and he called me out on it and he said, you have to stop doing that because you're doing something very different than I'm doing. And you can't compare your numbers with my numbers. And it's, and like you and I have talked about, like, it's not even about the numbers, but it's still falling into that trap of it being about the numbers, how many listeners we have, because it kind of, it can impress people that so many people have found it. But it can kind of work against you too. And so, I forget where I was going with that, but something about identity kind of being tied up sometimes with the metrics, and I mean,
yeah, that's true.
You see this in traditional academic, like publishing and that kind of thing, right? How many articles have you published? What have you co-authored? How many times have those articles gotten cited, and that kind of thing? And sometimes it's like, yeah, like sometimes it's not just about the numbers.
Exactly.
Or sometimes we're doing things that can't really be measured.
Yep.
And like I certainly don't quite know yet how I'm to measure the success of PhDcast because it's an active experiment of figuring out what a podcast is going to look like while the podcast is happening.
Yes, you push in different directions and see where things go, right? There's no real North Pole here. There's sort of a general idea about what the conversation is going to be, and I think moving forward, when you continue to develop different aspects of this, it's probably important that you have both a sounding board as part of a conversation, and then also your own, sort of independent input into the microphone, right? In reaction to your, more personal circumstances.
Yeah. And I'm definitely hoping with this to kind of build on the kinds of podcasting that we did that's very conversational, the kind of stuff I do with Forward, that again, conversational interview, semi-structured interview, those kinds of ideas, but then also exploring different ways that I can explore ideas and present ideas. But coming back to the hero's journey for a moment, something, again, this didn't really occur to me until I was sitting in class and talking, and we were having the discussion that the hero's journey, I think, applies really well to the academic writing process or project creation process, rather than just the academic as a person, but kind of to that project process where you start out with a quest, you start out with an idea, a question you want to answer, and then you have people who help you with that along the way, but there's always like a dark place. There's always a necrosis or catabasis of sorts, but then you come out the other side of it with something interesting that furthers a conversation.
Yep. Yeah, it can be personal, like you said, or it can be, work, something tangible. So yeah, I think it applies. It's a reasonable paradigm to assume, right? As we've discussed.
So it's getting noisy out in the hallway, which I'm sure the microphone is picking up, and we have been chatting for a little bit, not as long as we usually talk on MythTake, but a little bit longer than I have been for this podcast. So, was there anything else that you wanted to bring up or share?
No, not offhand. Okay. I think that the article does a good job in laying out, in communicating its ideas. I was somewhat disheartened to see that Homer was credited with being, waylaid on an island by Calypso. But,
I think that was a proofreading oversight.
I think we figured that out. But yeah, like anytime anyone talks about these things, raises these things of interest to myself, I'm there to listen because, this is an article that is about, the educational process, right, of becoming and developing a scholarly identity. That's sort of outside of my wheelhouse. But as soon as they open up a portal to talk about the hero, I'm there because, again, it demonstrates its universal quality, its applicability. It's not going away anytime soon, right? It's something that Campbell knew, and something that we know. It's something that Professor Norris knows, right? Mm-hmm. And so great, right? Lightning rod. I'm all for it.
I think there's one last thing about identity that I want to add, because this is kind of serendipitous timing. So it's not specifically about the hero's journey angle, but my friend and colleague Jane Moorish recently did a knowledge mobilization workshop for us in humanities, and one of the things that she brought up is as an example that sometimes we have trouble sharing our research because we identify ourselves in kind of very narrow ways. So her example was that if you identify yourself as a scholar of dead poets, then yes, it is very hard to figure out how to be that community engaged scholar. But if you if you're willing to think differently about what you do, or maybe you look at issues of gender in poetry or something like that, then by being able to take different perspectives on what it is that you are actually doing, it can open up new opportunities and different ways of engaging people. And so I really like the idea that and again, this is something Professor Norris brings up, it's not a fixed identity. It's a hopefully constantly changing and evolving identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to be pulled off center occasionally, but you're going to recognize that. And it truly, if what you're doing is important to you, you're going to realign yourself and tie it all together.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Darrin. It's been
You're
wonderful
welcome.
to be across the microphone from you again. And
right.
I am sure that I will have you back on future episodes to talk about things and about podcasting
Wonderful.
adventures. So thank you.
Have a good day. Thanks for having me.
What a fun conversation. I really enjoyed talking to Darrin and listening back to that conversation. Though I'm not used to hearing myself talk quite so much on a podcast. I'm usually busy getting the other person to do all the talking. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm really curious to know what you think about the topic and how it jives with your experience. Feel free to get in touch with me. There's contact info in the show notes and a link to my webpage. There's a form there, or you can send me an email. A reminder as well that you can view this podcast with subtitles on YouTube and that transcripts are available by request. So if you know somebody who's interested but isn't able for whatever reason to listen to the episode, again, just get in touch and I'm happy to send that over. And today's music, yes, there is music. Today's music is The Grand Dark Waltz by Kevin MacLeod, and it's used under Creative Commons licensing. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will join me again on the next episode.